directors, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. I am delighted to see you here as this work week unfolds in Paris under the authority of the Minister for Europe and Foreign Affairs, Catherine Colonna, the Minister for Foreign Trade, Olivier Besse, the Secretary of State for Europe, Laurence Boone, the Secretary of State for Development and Partnerships, Susana Zacharopoulou. Each and every one of you is serving the French people, and thank you for that. Making a speech like this is difficult for two reasons, and it's getting harder and harder every year. For yours truly. Speeches are always too long, and the more you read your text, the more you realize that there are things that you have forgotten to talk about. So, you try to be as exhaustive as possible, and while at the same time making sure the speech is palatable for the audience. And year after year, you are faced with two different risks. There's always a chance you may repeat yourself. I will try to not do that today, and I apologize in advance if I do lapse. Secondly, and that's bad, you don't want to contradict yourself. So I will do my best to avoid both risks. Of course, circumstances change, and sometimes you may have to revisit the things that you did say in the past. One thing is sure, however, and that thing is intangible. Your commitment as the diplomatic armed branch of our government plays an important part for our country. We deploy the energy, the talent, and the ambition that make it possible for this country to become a land of innovation for a fast transition towards their carbon neutrality, a major player for security in Europe and in the rest of the world, a key partner for development and solidarity internationally. That is all the result of your work and your commitment under circumstances that are becoming more and more complex. And before we get down to brass tacks, I would like to start by saying a few words about the background. At the end of the day, things have gotten tougher since I last addressed you. We live in a more complex world, a more fragmented world. We need to discuss the wherewithal that we give ourselves before we list our top 4 priorities. Many of these priorities have been very much in line with our efforts of the past few years. The international context is becoming more and more complicated, and there's a risk that the West may become weakened, particularly the EU. Let us be lucid while not falling into pessimism or excessive pessimism. Our population is becoming diluted objectively. Our share of world trade is becoming diluted. This is particularly true since the latest crisis. A new world power are emerging. The energy crisis is making things worse. And we need to consolidate our existing strategies. Next, gradually, our international order is being challenged, its principles are being challenged, its various forms of organization as well. The West used to have pride of place. It still does, but there's a rise in the number of conflicts. A war has returned to European soil. I'll get back to that in a minute. De facto strategies are gaining ground throughout the world. Anti-French sentiment is rife and is fueled by actual or perceived anti-colonialism. And there's a double standard that is being criticized. And sometimes we're responsible for that. International law was adjusted based on what we thought was the right thing to do. And there is growing criticism of the UN Security Council as well as a number of international organizations. And that is a message that we have to hear. The IMF, the World Bank, and beyond, a growing number of countries have lost their inhibitions and believe that those world agencies have less and less legitimacy in setting the rules, and they were created in a country where those countries did not exist, and that is true. And they represent an outdated world order and no longer reflect the geopolitical or even demographic and sometimes military situation of the day. Now, let's not lose sight of reality, but this is reflected in recent symptoms, with attempts by BRICS countries to expand their forum. We need to be lucid when it comes to what that means in reality, but this also shows a determination to help emerge an alternative order that would come and replace the international order that is seen as too Western and less legitimate, particularly against the backdrop of growing tensions between China and the US. And of course, this rocks the international order. In recent months, this has meant that our international commercial order is being challenged. We have the number 1 and number 2 trade powers that are now deciding not to respect WTO rules. It's a new thing, and we cannot sweep it under the rug. There are new forms of protectionism on the rise, and this means that there's a risk that the world may be partitioned, that the international order that is based on law may be weakened, democracy is weakened, there's a rise in illiberal powers, and our ideas of partnership are being weakened. At this time, we are faced with growing global challenges that require more coordination: peace and stability, the climate, biodiversity, fighting poverty, promoting development, but also artificial intelligence, digital technologies, the fight against tax fraud, etc. All of these challenges require more cooperation internationally. So we are faced with such paradox, and our strategy should, as much as possible, to seek to provide strong answers. Against this backdrop, our diplomatic efforts should keep it simple. We should protect our interests. Our security, our cultural, diplomatic, technology-related, or economic interests should be protected. We should also stand for our principles, which stand us apart from other countries. Our values are universal. They seek to be universal, protecting human dignity, human rights, partnering with humanitarian players, defending the international order, and showing respect for the sovereignty of peoples. We are building such diplomatic efforts on independence. Yes, we may have allies. Yes, we are part of strong organizations such as the EU. And yet, we want to talk to all parties, and we want our diplomatic efforts to be based on trust, on balances, equidistance. We want to build concrete solutions to the challenges that I referred to. And to that end, we have in recent years, particularly in recent months, given ourselves the wherewithal to make it happen. Many thanks to the administrations as well as the lawmakers in this room, because we have made strong, coherent choices against that international backdrop. A year ago, right here, I did say that we are embracing our diplomatic efforts. For the past 3 decades, our numbers have dwindled, and on 16th of March, I paid a visit to the Foreign Ministry, and I did say that we need to give new resources, new ways and means to our diplomats so they can embrace new challenges, influence communications. We need renewed working methods. We need to facilitate interdisciplinarity, cross-fertilization. You can always refer back to the speech I made that day. Also, we have strengthened our inclusive investment policies. We are giving more pride of place to ODA, reaching a record level of 0.05% of our 2023 budget. This is in line with our 2017 commitment. And this means that France is now the 4th net contributor to the global effort when it comes to inclusive investments. At the same time, we have carried out deep reforms of AFD. the development efforts are being made. Inclusive investments are key. We have set up a laboratory for testing new methods, new experiments, rolling them out on the field. Our geographic priorities are shifting. We need more flexibility to serve our partnership and inclusive investment policies because we need to make them more concrete. We need to take real action and make real investments. Meanwhile, we have set up a more credible military apparatus. Our armed forces have always been strong, but via the two military spending bills, which both rely on strong strategic reviews, on that basis, we will have doubled the budget for our armed forces, and that is unprecedented in this day and age. We have doubled that budget while facing new risks, new conflicts, cybersecurity, aerospace, the high seas, not forgetting the new areas where conflicts may emerge, while at the same time strengthening the strong suits of our armed forces. We want a complete model based on independence. We want to turn the French armed forces into Europe's most effective armed forces. That is our goal. Many thanks to our soldiers for their dedication, and many thanks to them for partnering with our diplomats. This being said, as we roll out the consistency of these investments against the complex backdrop that I described, at the end of the day, I would like to focus my words on four main priorities.
First of all, we need to have a security and stability policy in the context of the war in Ukraine. Next, I would like to talk about our European independence and pursuing our economic, technological, and strategic interests. Then, I would like to discuss the fact that France, in this context, should seek to be a trusted partner on the geographical front and also to reform international governance. And finally, I would like to talk about our influence in the framework of this strategy. And all of this is perfectly aligned with what I have been saying in recent years, your commitment and your own work, and of course the challenges that we are faced with. I joked, and it is true that I will not talk about every region of the world, but perhaps I'll mention a few. Now, to come back to these four themes, I wished to thank once again all those who had to live through very difficult, critical conditions. France and its diplomats was faced in certain countries with very difficult conditions, be it Sudan, where France was exemplary in the evacuation of its own citizens and the evacuation of a number of other citizens, in Niger as well. And I would like to commend your colleagues listening to us from the embassy. Being a diplomat is a commitment that is often risky, and you have always demonstrated your spirit of great responsibility, and we saw it recently in Afghanistan as well and elsewhere. And I think it's important to emphasize that, given the current context, and it is likely to occur again. Of course, I mentioned Afghanistan, but there are several other arenas such as Ukraine and others. Security and stability above all, as I said. Our collective security, France, its allies, its European partners, that is being challenged by the Russian aggression in Ukraine. I took the floor on a number of occasions last year, or more recently in Vilnius. Let us not forget the unique dimension of this conflict. First of all, it is based on the idea, or there is the idea, that war is back in Europe. It is very clearly back, and it is violating popular sovereignty and the territorial integrity of a country. and as such it violates international law. It has been exacerbated by multiple war crimes, attacks on civilians, and scenes that we have witnessed and that we are trying to resolve through our judicial systems, through our law enforcement systems. Also, a permanent member of the Security Council, that is also a nuclear power, is involved, which means that our diplomatic response has to be effective, and that means that the nature of our response, both political and military, needs to be specific. France and its allies, I think, had an adequate response. First of all, it was an immediate, united and effective response. And it stems from France's commitment at the time. When the war began in Ukraine, France held the rotating presidency of the European Council, and I think that our response generated surprise because it was so swift and united and adequate. A number of sanctions against Russia were adopted to weaken its ability to sustain the war effort. Support to Ukraine, humanitarian, economic, military support, right up until commitments made in Vilnius by France, Europe and its allies. European countries are Ukraine's number one support. The EU is its number one support. And I'd like to acknowledge, of course, also the support brought by our American allies, but let us not forget the strength of our own. And at the same time, we had no escalation policy. Those were the limits to our support. We made sure that we were not directly engaged in conflict against Russia, against its territory, against its population. And that has been, of course, a challenge. We ensured in parallel to avoid a partition of the world, and we remain focused on the future. And I think we were right to follow that policy over close to 18 months. Avoiding a global partition means avoiding a narrative that would suggest that this is a European war. Indeed, it actually should be of concern to the entire world because it challenges our values, our principles, and territorial integrity. And that is why in all international fora, this war needs to be at the heart of our concerns. It needs to be condemned by all and needs to be at the heart of diplomatic action. We need to avoid division. This is work that we need to continue doing. So be it at the General Assembly of the UN, where we have been able to reduce the number of votes aligned with Russia, or sometimes abstentions, or a lack of participation. We will need to continue convincing, explaining, and we have upcoming meetings that will be crucial in that regard. But as we did on the margins of the G7 in Hiroshima, we need to have Ukraine help us convince our partners, and France's strategy has indeed done that. So that when we speak of peace, as indeed peace has come up in a number of proposals, peace should mean the same thing every day, everywhere, that is. It cannot be simply a ceasefire recognizing the de facto situation, as that would mean war or worse tomorrow. Peace means long-lasting peace, respecting the sovereignty of the Ukrainian people as well as international law. And that is what is being done in order to come to a viable situation. It concentrates the efforts that we have already undertaken and avoids a partition of the world. France has worked alongside the IAEA in order to avoid the risk of proliferation in that regard. In the months to come, we will continue to focus on these priorities We will continue to work relentlessly to avoid a division of the international order, to continue our support and demonstrate the unwavering nature of our support to Ukraine in its war effort, and prepare durable peace. And we will do so through different diplomatic efforts that are essential. And France will continue to work on short-term humanitarian efforts, which we have done by hosting refugees. And I thank the work of the Ministry of Interior and other competent ministries, as well as on the humanitarian front in Ukraine. And we wish to continue working on post-war reconstruction, which is also fundamental. But that sustainable peace, that stability also requires work on the European level. I wanted to dwell on that for a moment. Now, I would ask you to refer to the speech I made in Bratislava during the GlobSec conference on the consequences of war in Ukraine for our security architecture and how we might conceive European security architecture. There is a before the war and there is a post-war context. And in our work and in our diplomatic efforts, we need to incorporate the consequences of the war in order to truly establish long-lasting peace. First of all, we need to prepare to do so as NATO members, and that's what we've been doing as allies since day one. And we were the first country to be able to deploy our forces in Romania on the eastern flank of NATO. And that is the strength of our model. We continued to work with the Baltic states to participate in NATO missions, as well as with the air police. We strengthened our defense missions, and that is absolutely vital. We need to continue that work for as long as the war lasts, and should also include the adaptation of the French and European military strategy and apparatus. Within NATO, we need greater European involvement. That has been the case since 2019. I've mentioned this on several occasions. In my opinion, in the months and the years to come, we will need to continue working on this front. The European pillar and a greater European defense within NATO, that is not competition for NATO. Quite the contrary, that is what makes us a trusted partner to the US. We need to take these threats to our neighborhood seriously, and that is important in the context of our relationship with the US. We need to produce, we need to standardize for the defense industry in Europe, and we need to think of our defense in European terms. And as such, we will no longer be a European minority within NATO. And that is why, after the war in Ukraine, we will need to work on new treaties on armaments and military equipment in Europe. And those are treaties that we will design as well as sign. That is what I recently said, that Europe was a geopolitical object of sorts, but we were not signatories of the relevant military treaties. And it seemed that we passively had to accept certain terms instead of being its architects. So we need to be architects of that new international order, which affects us through our military involvement. And the military spending bill has that at its heart, because France would be at the helm of such coalitions. And that is what we've started doing in certain African countries. We need to continue to convince our European partners that this strategy is necessary through defense cooperation, whether bilateral or European, through greater strategic and operational cooperation, as well as cooperation in terms of capacity. And I'd like to mention the future combat air system that we are building with Germany, for instance. I know that it's difficult. I know that sometimes we are challenged, and we will not waver on the strategic nature of these partnerships that were concluded in July 2017 with Chancellor Merkel at the time. But we need to continue pursuing them for the long run and build new partnerships, be it in aerospace, on the maritime front, or cyberspace. Moreover, we need to consider European stability, not only in terms of security, and not only through NATO as a vehicle. And that is what we wanted to suggest with the creation of the European Political Community in May 2022. That's actually an ancient French and Czech idea. It's what Václav Havel and François Mitterrand suggested at the time with the European Confederation. At the time, it did not see the light of day because Russia was involved, and perhaps it was too early at the time, too early in history to suggest that type of alliance and open partnership. But that European political community put forward in May 2022 already met twice in Prague and in Chisinau. And a new meeting is to be held in Grenada in a short time. That is a victory for France and for Europe as well. Europe is a vast geopolitical continent, and it's not just about military alliances that stem from history. It is about thinking about immigration, energy, security, innovation, connectivity, and so on. Ultimately, we need to build that cooperation with greater convergences to consolidate a geopolitical Europe.
We will continue to move forward on that front. This forum will play a key role in order for us to sustainably build the kind of Europe we want. Over and beyond this, then, we have our own European Union. In the next few months, but I will come back to that point specifically. In the next few months, the EU will experience a twofold movement, which is not incompatible, but it will require boldness and institutional changes. We in Europe need to integrate our policies more. It's important in terms of autonomy, defense, climate, technology, economic matters. Our REACT Accord needs to be more integrated in order for us to address current challenges. In order for us to be more stable and stronger, we need to expand, enlarge the EU toward the Western Balkans, to cope with interference, geopolitical instability, which forever fuels despair and misunderstandings. Enlargement and integration should go hand in hand. A 27-member state EU is difficult to shift when it really matters, and things will be even tougher when there are 32 or 35 member states. So we need to be bold, to accept more integration for some policies, and sometimes working at different speeds. I had an opportunity to discuss that 5 years ago, and I will get back to that point in a couple of months. So clearly, the EU will be a cornerstone of the new stability order. To my mind, when it comes to the European political community or NATO and other matters, we need to structure the post-war order right here, right now. But this means not losing sight of our geopolitical and military realities. We need to be willing to preserve our union and conserve the impetus for deepening the EU for those members that are willing to go in that direction. Not everybody is. We need to maintain our appeal, but for that we need to be bold. And of course, this means that in the next few months and years, we need to stand firm when it comes to our doctrine and our strategy vis-à-vis Ukraine and Russia. Russia cannot and should not win this war. This would mean, if it did win, this would mean instability on European soil. And this would forever undermine the principles of the international order. For us and our allies, this means making financial and diplomatic investments, investing into capabilities over the next few years. This will mean call into question some of our fundamentals. We cannot pretend such efforts are not necessary, but we need to show consistency. Otherwise, everything that I just discussed would not be as relevant. Our humanitarian and security interests go over and beyond this. And there are 2 and 3 concerns I would like to discuss here. Let's remain vigilant when it comes to the security situation and political situation in the Western Balkans. On this front, together with Germany, we have built a new roadmap and a new proposal regarding differences between Serbia and Kosovo. And I believe this is a good roadmap. It's been supported by European negotiators and our own representatives, so we expect a clear re-engagement by both parties. A re-engagement when it comes to the municipal elections expected, a Serbian re-engagement in related organizations, recognition of municipalities in the north of Serbia on behalf of Kosovo authorities. We expect peace will be brought to this situation. France and Germany have made those commitments when it comes to visa policies and other economic issues that will be reviewed unless both parties behave responsibly or fail to behave responsibly. We need to be extremely vigilant on that front, particularly when stability of the Western Balkans is at stake. We will continue our commitment with regard to the Caucasus following the 2020 conflict. We spoke against the humanitarian disaster there, which is of particular concern in the High Karabakh region. This week I will have an opportunity to discuss matters with Minister Pachinian and President Aliyev. We will ask that the humanitarian corridor be fully respected. We will take another diplomatic initiative to that end internationally so as to ramp up the pressure. But nothing can justify the current humanitarian situation being experienced by the populations of the High Karabakh region. We will maintain our commitment. It is that information that made it possible to set up a European mission following the Prague summit of our European political community. For the first time, both parties signed a common text recognizing the 1991 borders. We will maintain a commitment to discussions on a peace treaty to discuss territorial or transit arrangements, but right now the humanitarian situation is dire and must be resolved. Regarding security and stability issues, let us not forget how important it is that we continue our fight against terror. Yes, events on the domestic front have quieted down thanks to our excellent intelligence and domestic law enforcement forces. A lot of planned terror attacks have been botched, but the nature of terrorism has changed over the past few years. Therefore, we need to remain extremely vigilant. There are international terrorism organizations that can affect us on our soil. I'm saying this forcefully and clearly. We're still involved in the international coalition in the Levant. Such involvement is important. I would like to commend it. I would also like to commend the memory of our 2 soldiers who died in Iraq in recent weeks, specifically as part of our missions on Iraqi soil. Cooperation, training, support missions, but also missions to fight terrorism. In the Levant, we will maintain our involvement in that mission. We need to strengthen the work that we've been doing in recent years to militarily and politically stabilize the region in support of Iraqi sovereignty. We set up the Baghdad Conference, and the 3rd edition of that conference will be held at the end of November. I will, of course, attend. This will be an opportunity to consolidate the regional agenda in support of Iraqi sovereignty. In this capacity, we will also strengthen our involvement when it comes to 2 specific topics. I'm not going to be exhaustive here, but these are the 2 concerns. First of all, Syria. We clearly see that every country in the region is resuming talks with Syria, trying to reinsert Syria back into the various negotiating bodies or partnership agreements. Amongst others, there will be an essential aspect that we will need to discuss, and that's the fight against terror. I will return to the Baghdad Conference with the goal of focusing on our dialogue with Jordan, the United Arab Emirates, Iraq, as I said before, Saudi Arabia, and other countries. In order to become once again a member of a regional organization, such countries need to play their part in the fight against terrorism. This also means a political process to allow refugees to go home. They need guarantees that they'll be protected, that they'll be recognized, that their economic and political safety and security will be protected on Syrian soil. The second thing I wanted to discuss is Iran. I commend the advances of the past 2 weeks. But talking from experience, let's not sit on our laurels. We all know that all agreements can be fragile. Just because you sign an agreement doesn't mean you won't pull out eventually. And it doesn't mean you won't go against your word. France will maintain a clear policy vis-à-vis Iran. There will be no weakness on that front. We strongly demand that our 6 French nationals, which are currently being held captive, be freed. Nothing can justify that Iran should hold 6 French nationals in Iranian prisons. Of course, we need clear, transparent supervision of nuclear activities in Iran. A return to the JCPOA agreement is a very good thing, as long as the International Nuclear Agency provide the necessary supervision. We will need to continue to supervise such activities. That is absolutely key to the entire region. Third aspect, let's not forget it, we need to supervise what Iran has been doing in the region in terms of stability or lack thereof. We need to clarify Iran's policy vis-à-vis its direct neighbors, Israel, the security of Israel, Lebanon and its security. On this note, many thanks to Jean-Yves Le Drian. On my behalf, he's been conducting a mission for the past few months. Yes, Mr. Minister, Sisyphus can be happy. Let's imagine that. And over the short term, I believe that a key aspect of that political solution in Lebanon will require clarifying regional interference by countries, including Iran. Lastly, stability, security, the fight against terrorism. These topics mean I have to discuss Africa. In Africa, our approach is not just security-based. It's not even the mainstay of our approach. But there is a strong security component because of the terrorist risks, which are ongoing, and also because sovereign states request that we come in and help. It is against this backdrop that the Serval and Barkhane operations have been decided, and I'm saying this forcefully because if we forget that, and if we give in to the unacceptable arguments put forward by this Baroque alliance between Pan-African leaderships and neo-imperialists, then this is a madhouse. France intervened in Africa as early as 2013 because African states asked us to, because they were being divided into two. Without the French intervention, if our troops had not died in action in Africa, if the Serval and Barkhane operations had not been launched, today we wouldn't be talking about Mali, Burkina Faso, or Niger. Those states would no longer exist with their existing borders, and I can say that with 100% certainty. Sometimes I hear French political leaders explain to us that Barkhane operation was a failure. Why are you using the enemy's arguments? This doesn't help anyone. And you're not paying tribute to our own troops. So we need to forcefully stand for the legitimacy of those operations. We came in to help countries that are our friends and our partners. We help them defend their own soil against terrorists at home. Was that a wrong thing to do? Please, of course not. So yes, we need to be demanding. We need to rethink new partnerships. We should not give in to contemporary forms of paternalism. Getting back to our African policy, let's not turn the tables. If there's a government that wants to defend its own territories on a legal basis and ask for our help, it is legitimate that we should provide it. Now, the framework, the ECOWAS framework in particular, is being altered. Why? Well, because we should not overstay our welcome, and also because the nature of terrorism is shifting, because there are ethnic factors on the rise, because there are political and economic shifts taking place in the Sahel region. And to some extent, this is creating a crisis over the long term. And new forms of terrorism are the consequence of that crisis. So yes, our intervention was relevant, but we need to change the shape of it. We need to make adjustments. And so a couple of years ago, we adjusted our apparatus, and earlier this year, we decided on a policy to shift our partnerships. That's what we're doing, and we will go even further in the next few months. Why? Because having a stable presence, which is based on our troops, that's an argument that is used by our enemies as part of a war of information designed to weaken us. But the heart of our response should be political. On behalf of African states, France cannot be a substitute. A military response cannot simply replace the political response. We need first and foremost a political response. A military presence must be structured on the basis of partnerships, which is what African countries want, whether when it comes to training or equipment. So we're rethinking the framework for that partnership entirely, particularly when it comes to the military capabilities that we are delivering.
And in the framework of the military spending bill, the minister and the army chief of staff have made proposals, but it is essential to move forward on this front along with new partners. Benin, for instance, to name but one in the Gulf of Guinea, or Kenya, with whom we are working on new regional operations. Focusing on regional forces that can help us guarantee security in the region. And for Niger, that has been our approach as well. Now, that was an overview, but I'd like to come back to events of this summer. This is a coup d'etat against a democratically elected president who is an ethnic minority, who led very brave reforms in politics, in the economy, in a number of realms, a president that is committed to our values and that of the UN, who was taken hostage in the presidential palace in a coup d'etat close to a month ago. Now, people say that France was too close to President Bazoum. I read this in the media and elsewhere. But what would we do if such a coup d'etat took place in Bulgaria or Romania? Would we have said, oh, let's not go there? Would we say, oh, let's see who the generals suggest as a prime minister? Would we say something like that? Is that what the other capitals want? Would that not be, are we not engaging in a double standard here? We have a man who's democratically elected, who is brave, who is upstanding. I say he's brave because he does not resign. He has not resigned, and we're being told that the way to go is to desert him because it's important to follow the local approach. That seems to be the latest trend. I read the news. I saw op-eds that suggested, well, let's not do too much. It's perilous. No, I disagree. We need to be clear. We need to be consistent. If not, who will listen to us? In which African country will we possibly be in a position to say that we have a partnership with them when we simply abandon them? And so I think that we're adopting the right approach. Our ambassador on the ground is staying put in spite of everything. Our armed forces and troops are remaining committed as well. And we should not espouse the narrative that France is Niger's enemy. The problem is the leaders of this coup d'etat, who is the people behind the coup d'etat, who are abandoning reform, who are abandoning the fight against terrorism, and in fact are abandoning the interest of its civilians. If we don't say that loud and clear, who will? So let's not be overly simplistic. And our policy is simple. We do not recognize the people behind the coup d'etat. We support the president who has not resigned. We stand firm beside him, and we support the diplomatic action and the possibly military strategy of ECOWAS, neither paternalistic nor weak. Otherwise, we get nowhere, and we need to continue supporting him firmly, and I call on all the states in the region to uphold that policy, because if all the presidents of ECOWAS were to abandon President Bazoum, well, I'm sure they all know what fate would have in store for them. And I think we saw it in recent coups as well. There's a bit of a coup epidemic in the Sahel, which rests on the weakness of military systems, lack of effectiveness, and the policy that we need to implement, and which I will describe. This is a very difficult context, in particular for Nigerians and for people on the front lines, but let's avoid any double standard. Let us be firm and unwavering. So that was my first point on security and stability, and rest assured it was the longest point. Next, our economic, technological, strategic goals, which all aim to strengthen our independence, short-term and long-term. Independence does not mean autarky. It means that we choose the partners we want, but we cannot be a power with a strong diplomatic and military reach if we have dependencies. We went through that quite recently in Europe, and that was a wake-up call. It should really fuel and feed our approach in all respects, and particularly diplomacy. That is the key to our security. On the international level, we are reallocating resources and innovations. And what is at play today will shape the world in 10 or 15 years. So first of all, resources and rare materials. There's a predatory approach to this. The Chinese did this first. Initially, we didn't necessarily understand, but actually we do need to position ourselves on these rare minerals and resources. And next, there is green industry and artificial intelligence. There is new investment and reallocation in production that needs to be done to create jobs in our countries and to have a sovereign civilian and military technology in the future. This absolutely needs to underpin our diplomatic approach. We need a French and European approach to strategic autonomy. Some years ago, I talked about a more sovereign Europe, and it was suggested that this was a kind of a French whim in the politest of terms. And I would say that in the last 5 years, there was an awakening. Not only was this idea adopted by Europe at large, so the idea of sovereignty, of strategic autonomy, whatever the terms may be. I'm not familiar with the 50 Shades of Grey on the subject, but I think the meaning is the same. That is, being masters of our own destiny in terms of what we buy, what we produce, and diversification. And so in recent years, in the field of technology, in energy, we really came to an awakening in Europe. On defense, this work has already begun, and we need to go further still. During the pandemic and after that, we began production on the health front. We also worked on semiconductors and green technologies through legislation by the Commission and investments that were made. And for me, it is the Versailles Agenda, which we created in March 2022, that consolidates this strategic autonomy in semiconductors, in green technology, in digital, and so on. And of course, the French-German partnership is absolutely essential. In Hamburg, I discussed AI with the Chancellor, and that French-German team is decisive, given that we're facing a shock that is disrupting Europe. And so I think it's important to have shared views on the subject. But Europe at large needs to go further and faster. And I'd like to mention a few aspects of this strategic autonomy. First of all, we need to have a European energy policy that is clearer. Now, we have the regulatory foundations of this with Fit for 55 and the Green Deal. But now we need to define its individual instruments, and we have our work cut out for us. We need to be more independent, we need greater decarbonation, and we need to create jobs within the EU. So we need more renewables, more nuclear, more electric in Europe. And we may not all see eye to eye on this. And that is why we will need to redouble our efforts. Of course, more coal in Europe is bad for this agenda. Too much dependency is bad for this agenda. Regulatory complexity on hydrogen is bad for this agenda. I am for the free movement of low-carbon electrons in Europe. I think that that is positive for Europe's energy future. The more of that we have, the more likely we are to have an autonomous, low-carbon Europe. And so we need to work with our German friends on this. We don't agree on everything, and I think that it would be a mistake to give up on nuclear or to slow down our nuclear investments and nuclear innovation in Europe. We should not fall out based on these visions. Instead, we should strengthen our electrical network. Next, we need to have clear industrial policies. That is something we've started to do. We need to go further and faster as well. I gave a speech in The Hague on our new European security doctrine. And of course, I believe that we need a strong common market, greater integration of digital across the board. But we also need to have a clear policy for industry, because the Chinese and the Americans are already doing it. And if I were to sum it up, I think Europe has a tendency to over-regulate and to under-invest too slowly. And so a true competitive policy for industry in Europe would mean more innovation, more investment, and less over-regulation. So to implement what we've committed to do and to have stronger economic clout, to be able to implement faster, be it green technology, be it AI or other aspects, to be able to compete with the US or China. Now, at the end of last year, following the Inflation Reduction Act, I made a strong statement on this, and I think we need to continue to forge ahead. Third, we need to have a more realistic trade policy. I've said it before, Europe cannot continue to implement the older types of trade treaties. We need to include our strategic interests and climate in the new treaties that we conclude. Now, China and the US can't simply say that green technologies do not require them to follow the WTO's rules. I do not want a Europe in which you can only buy green technology that comes from the US or China. We cannot have French vehicles taxed to 25% when they're sold in China, and Chinese vehicles that are not taxed or taxed far less in France. I have a lot of respect for the Chinese, but let us not be naive. Let us have a strategy that aligns with our interests and that is aligned with our climate objectives. We cannot ask our farmers to adhere to certain standards when other powers may not apply them. And we cannot stand for this. That is what fuels populism throughout Europe and actually leads to an increase in extremism throughout Europe. That is why we continue to put forward trade agreements that would allow us to that would not allow the import of products which do not respect our standards in terms of climate, biodiversity, and more. And that is how we can be standard setters on that front.
We have put pressure on a lot of powers because of the standards we have set, particularly when it comes to fighting deforestation. So we need a more integrated and united approach that is at the very heart of our agenda for strategic autonomy for the EU. Let's look at the 2024 milestones that will provide structure to the European debate. Everything that I'm discussing will enable a more united, more integrated, and more lucid EU. This agenda has to be clarified and will require pivotal structures. Our independence and the defense of our economic interests, technology, and strategic interests are based on that European agenda, which should be driven and defended as well as augmented in the next few weeks and months. On the bilateral front, there are three main things that I expect you to do over and beyond your bread and butter. We need to continue to strengthen our efforts when it comes to exports. Our trade situation is not good because of our energy dependency. It is also why we need a low-carbon strategy. We need to phase out fossil fuels. It's a good strategy, commercially speaking, but the main thrust of our strategy, we continue to consolidate them. Yes, we are weakened because of excessive regulation, so we need to be careful when it comes to our food situation. Our agri-food policy, when it comes to exports, needs to be strengthened. Despite the commitment and the investments made by all of our producers, EU regulations are forming a 1,000-layer structure, which makes us weaker relative to other powers. So we need to step up our economic diplomatic efforts and support our exports. We're going to present a French export plan on that front, and many thanks to the entire team for their involvement. The entire team of France Export, Business France, the BPI Investment Bank, AFD, with Proparco, and all of the embassies and economic stations around the world. We need to continue to step up our support to SMEs, mid-caps, and startups. Our economic strength should be used to support exports. Also, we need to base our work on our various professions. There are major companies whose exports are really good, but we need to step up that good work more and more. We need an integrated offer. In the latter countries, that is the response to challenges when it comes to hydraulics, hydroelectricity, and the like. We need a profession-based, a business-based approach. We also need to generate more jobs. Our diplomatic efforts should serve French reindustrialization and job creation. I spent a long time helping big business, but I'm not sure they needed my help as much as smaller businesses or SMEs. Maybe it's better to help those companies that will generate employment and create jobs. So we need to prioritize. Humanity is all well and good. Yes, we want to work in humane fashion, but our priority is to create jobs and reduce unemployment at home. Let's also focus on our binationals and our diasporas, who are the lifeblood of our nation. We have built mechanisms that involve everybody here to help African diasporas who live in France to invest and drive their entrepreneurial projects on African soil so they can build more and more projects. This should be at the heart of all our stations in Africa. And thanks to the Maghreb Fund, we have rolled out an approach to allow all binationals to drive projects on either side of the Mediterranean. This project is also at the heart of our export policy. It should be promoted. It should be encouraged. These are not secondary things. Second important aspect on a bilateral front, new investments and a strategy to strengthen our appeal. I'll be quick here. Several campaigns have been introduced to you this morning. Choose France is an important strategy. We need to strengthen our efforts to consolidate that Choose France policy. Of course, we're doing a lot of work on that front at a national level, but the next edition will be held in May 2024. And here again, we need to keep up the good work. We may need to focus on a particular country, a particular region, a particular vertical sector. Last aspect, on the bilateral front, we need to secure inputs. Our economic and diplomatic roadmap should include aspects such as rare earths and rare materials. We have an interministerial delegate, Mr. Gazo, who's in charge of that. It is important for the roadmap to be clear for everyone. We need to factor that into our diversification efforts. I was the first French president to travel to Mongolia. Look at how much potential there is in that country when it comes to such critically important and rare earths. So we need a roadmap, and via our diplomatic efforts, as our ministries travel, we need to strengthen our key relationships with those countries that will help us secure access to such mineral ores or rare earths. Because, again, this is part and parcel of diversifying a lot of our production efforts and therefore strengthen our independence. I've talked about our independence and protecting our interests. This is the perfect segue into another tricky topic, immigration. It's a tricky topic for me as President of the Republic because I play two different tunes depending on whether I'm talking to our country or the international community. So we need to be better organized and more effective. That is what I asked our Home Minister and the Foreign Affairs Minister to do over the past few months, and many thanks to them for their work. So what do we need in terms of immigration? First of all, we need proper border control. I'm referring to the Schengen borders and also our domestic borders whenever there are risks that we need to prevent, risks such as terrorism. We seek to reduce unbridled immigration. We want to fight illegal immigration, fight all forms of non-cooperation within the EU, which is blowing up our domestic organization because the asylum law is being circumvented. And this means that people overstay their welcome, fall into the hands of smuggling rings, and have to be deported. We need to work as part of a framework that is in line with the principles and our values, the right of asylum and protection of freedom fighters. Let's remember that a lot of our French citizens marry non-French citizens and want them to come home. So we need to work in more effective and more resolved fashion. So we have taken action at the European level. We undertook that effort under the French presidency. This has helped us strengthen the mechanisms for protecting our common borders. We will continue that effort. There are two aspects that I would like to emphasize. While making those efforts, we, of course, want to maintain our appeal, allow for free movement of talents. We want to attract the best students, while at the same time making it possible for them to go and serve their countries. That's the rationale behind our partnerships. We want to bring in the best talents, the best artists, the best entrepreneurs, the best engineers, while at the same time maintaining our influence. But for that, we need effective tools and we need clear objectives. Firstly, we need to implement the Hermelin report regarding the visa policy. This report is a post-mortem of what we did wrong when we decided to toughen up our visa policy vis-à-vis a number of countries that don't play fair on that front. This was an inconvenience to a lot of families. And this deteriorated our reputation, our image, without making it possible to work more effectively. But that doesn't mean we should be overly lenient. No, we need strong policies while at the same time being smart about drawing the line. We need to streamline our visa policy when the situation warrants. So we're not effective enough when fighting criminal rings, and we create too much turbulence for those who love France as part of bilateral relations. So that's something we need to change. Secondly, we need a clearer European policy, and that's what we're working on. When it comes to oversight and making visa granting operations contingent upon standards being met. We toughened up our conditions when a number of our neighbors made it easier for immigration to flow through. So we need an EU-wide policy, at least as part of the Schengen area. And that's a discussion we will be having over the next few months. So we're striking a tricky balance because we refuse the path of least resistance. We want to remain an attractive and open power, but while at the same time fighting illegal immigration and criminal smuggling rings. Because this fuels insecurity in some neighborhoods, in some areas of our country. So we need a European-wide visa policy. Hence, the bill that is upcoming under the aegis of the relevant ministerial authorities. Thirdly, we need to play a part as a trusted partner. Last year, I talked about effective multilateralism. Against this backdrop, we are a balancing power. This is a challenge not for us, but we live in a more fragmented world, which requires more international cooperation. We need to avoid a partition of the world between two main powers. We don't want the world order to become fragmented. So we need to strengthen our action on various fronts and partnerships that I deeply believe in. We need to protect our interests, our principles, our sovereignty, while at the same time talking to every party. First of all, we need to renew our partnerships, particularly with Africa. I've talked about the security issues with Africa since the address in Ouagadougou in November 2017, and also the conference that was held on February 27th. Via my various addresses, particularly in Montpellier, I believe this is part and parcel of our new approach. Our partnership with Africa must rely on a deep change in objectives, methods, and discussion partners. All too often, we continue to talk to capital cities only and the people in power. Of course, that's what we need to do across the world. That's the work of ambassadors, but more and more, we need to talk to civil society, the opposition, the lifeblood of the country at large. That is absolutely key. Yes, in Africa, we failed in a lot of ways because our apparatus was much too based on our personal relationship with those in power. But when civil society shifts, you know to shift accordingly. And when I see the amounts of inclusive investments made, the strength of our partnerships and our teams in those countries, that is simply not acceptable. So let's take the less trodden path. Let's work more closely with our partners and civil society. Let's make sure our agenda is more based on agriculture, climate, sports, education. These are the fundamentals for inclusive environments that we defined as part of the Presidential Council meeting. Let's make sure our priorities are not just geography-based, because this creates resilience. People get used to it, and habituation means that people don't realize all that good stuff comes from France and forget to say thank you. In France, we hear this narrative of neo-imperialism in Africa, but actually in many regions, people are unaware of what France does, in fact. So we need to engage with these different networks. We need to strengthen the different points that I mentioned. We need to focus on training, economic development, culture, sports, and all these different drivers. I want to talk about Africa Season 2020.
where we focused on innovation, technology, culture, which represented a dialogue with the continent. Africa creation in Paris in early October, and I call on all stations in Africa to be a part of this. And in the next 6 months, I want to finalize the Center for Africa, la Maison des Mondes Africains, which is an important aspect of this partnership. I encourage you to focus on greater influence, greater effectiveness, stronger ties. I want to stress our agenda to support democracy in Africa. Our past poses a challenge, and I said this very simply in Ouagadougou. I was born after decolonization. Now, the African continent, well, on the African continent, 70% of the population was born after decolonization. So we need to be careful when we talk about post-colonialism. Let's not be overly simplistic. That era is over, and today our policy is a focus on democracy. And Achille Mbembe's initiative, the fund that we have established, are an important part of this strategy. Again, we need to operate as partners. It is not a French initiative, but it is open to all, and it needs to be based on the philosophy that I've outlined. The second aspect was that of the Indo-Pacific. Since May 2018, we developed a strategy for the Indo-Pacific because we have 1.5 million people living in that area and 8,000 troops. And I'd like to redefine the terms of that policy. It is a policy for engaging with China. I've spoken at length about China in other speeches. I won't go into detail here. I made an important trip to China very recently. France is not hostile to China. We engage with China. We want to improve the terms of that engagement. For France, we know that peace and climate are issues on which we need China. We are clear-headed on the values we have in common and those that we do not. And so we have high standards and we are open to engagement. 2024 is an important year, 60 years of Sino-French diplomatic relations and a number of meetings and milestones. So I think that that is a pragmatic approach. We have never been naive. We have never been passive faced with China's assertiveness. And we've focused again on our strategic autonomy, on communication technologies. We were very clear this is a security issue, and we did not agree to China rolling out certain components. We are the European country with the fewest such components on our territory. So, on the Indo-Pacific, we want the Indo-Pacific to be free, open, and at peace. The bottom line is to preserve sovereignty without conflict, but reinvest in military presence, organize joint military exercises. We did so last summer to focus on our overseas territories with French Polynesia, New Caledonia, Wallis et Futuna, Reunion Islands, Mayotte, and more. An approach which focuses on those. And in Nouméa recently, I announced the military academy. We're also working with French Polynesia on military or economic infrastructure. We're doing it on the Reunion Island with partnerships in the Indian Ocean and an integrated diplomacy. The Indo-Pacific Partnership as we saw this summer, from Papua New Guinea to Vanuatu, helped us re-establish this relationship because many players do not want to be locked into a choice between the US on the one hand and China on the other. So, an open partnership without subjugation, and a partnership that is not equidistant. I really want to be clear because I don't want to be misquoted. Yes, you know, the US is our ally. We may have a different relationship with China and so on. Now, the third way is something that in general is better understood. So people in the region appreciate that. France is a great country, is a diplomatic, military and economic power, perhaps not a great demographic power, but certainly is a leader in Europe, is a trusted partner, and is offering a relationship that is not conflictual with China, but which does not propose to be completely subservient to China. And I think that that is based on common sense and is positive for the future. So this is a diplomatic agenda, a climate agenda focused as well on the blue economy, on culture, focusing on our overseas territories. And that is why we need to invest in regional diplomacy and on our overseas territories. I want to implement the same strategy in the Caribbean and in the Amazon. I am delighted that Martinique has joined CARICOM. I hope that Guadeloupe will be able to do the same. It's excellent to be able to develop regional partnerships. And Latin America. Now, I heard a lot about the Amazon summit this summer, but we are not a part of the treaty. So I was invited to the summit because France, through Guyana, is an Amazon state, and so it makes sense, actually, for France, through French Guyana, to be a part of this organization or any treaty. And I would like Brazil to accept our candidacy. I also want to talk about our partnerships in North Africa and the Mediterranean in recent years with civil society, and I mentioned it for Africa. It goes also for North Africa with the Two Shores Summit, cultural events for the years to come, a number of partnerships in culture and entrepreneurship. Again, let us be clear-headed. Bilateral relationships are still lacking on a number of fronts. Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, but also countries in the Near and Middle East. Now, why? Well, I wouldn't say that it is for lack of engagement. France has worked considerably on issues of memory and of economic crisis. But there are also rivalries, regional rivalries. There are heterogeneous challenges in the region. So we are going to implement a number of bilateral initiatives. I wish to re-engage with these countries in the months to come, consolidate what's already been done with the Baghdad Conference for the Near and Middle East. And by the end of the year, under the aegis of the minister, I would like to consolidate an intergovernmental initiative with the region at large. And the environment, climate, co-production, these are issues that should help us set out a regional agenda in new, different terms. Beyond this, approach based on geography. When I talk of France as a trusted partner, that also entails taking risks in matters of international governance. Indeed, international governance is faced with a crisis. It is being increasingly challenged. The Security Council, the UN, the IMF, the World Bank. I hear this everywhere. Open the window, and that's the word on the street. And some are taking advantage of it. The Gulf states look towards us today. They say, you speak of your principles, your rules, your IMF criteria. Who are you? An old, declining continent in terms of demography. You face energy security. You don't have you're not advanced technologically, so we'll work with India, China, and other countries better aligned with our agenda. That's what's happening. And in many countries, when you can't get funds from the IMF, you turn to the Gulf states or other rich countries who have deep pockets but a different agenda and values. Now, I'm not looking to downplay the BRICS Plus summit. But so there's new membership there. But what about new membership to the G20? Well, there's the African Union, perhaps. But our organizations that uphold international values and principles that I believe in, well, the problem is that these current challenges potentially could lead to a split. So I think that we need to appear as trusted partners and be able to undertake a deep-seated reform of international governance, in particular for the IMF and the World Bank. It is not acceptable that these systems that essentially have been designed by their first members, and who essentially are the rich countries, make the rules. We risk creating an alternative order that pushes our own interests to the side. So we need to reform the governance of these systems. Also, as Europeans, and I'm going to put this forward to certain heads of state and government, we need to develop new formats with India, Brazil, and South Africa, for instance. Let's not limit ourselves to the existing formats. I think it's important to engage with these emerging powers and create new modes of engagement and look to the climate, the energy agenda, beyond relationships we already have with the US, with China, and organizations that we are already a part of. Let us be bold, and I'm open to all of your suggestions. In that respect, we have already embarked on a journey, and I think that it will last for months and years to come. A meeting was held in June and gave way to the Paris Agenda for People and Planet. The summit gave way to that declaration, the 4 Ps, which works in English and French. English speakers appreciate these acronyms that slip off the tongue. The 4 Ps. Now, we built this agenda with countries of all types. And it rests on 4 principles. We should not have to choose between the fight against poverty and the fight against climate. Countries appreciated that because they thought we were preaching to them about how to achieve climate goals without helping them on poverty. Second, the path is defined at the national level. It is not dictated in Brussels or elsewhere. And so we build these partnerships to support the national trajectory.
Number 3. We need more public monies. We did that for ourselves, so we need to push that agenda further afield. So the IMF and the World Bank have been pressured to dictate new announcements, new guidelines. We need to roll this out. The agenda to fight poverty and protect the climate cannot be implemented unless we put in more money. We need more private sector money. That's number 4. And this is true for all of our development banks, our multilateral banks and our institutions. Unless we find the right driver, we will be crowded out. We need to mobilize private sector money. It is absolutely key to achieving the Paris Agenda for people and the planet. So the 4 Ps, that is what will structure our action over the next few months. At the end of the day, we're building a new international consensus between the public and the private sector. Poverty, climate, biodiversity. That's our agenda. In New York, we will hold the Paris Peace Forum on November 10th, 11th, and 12th. We will set up a small follow-up team. We will mobilize heads of state and government from all of the countries concerned, because this initiative should not be Paris-specific. And during that summit, I hope that just before the Olympics and Paralympics, we get to organize a summit for sustainable development in July 2024, right here in Paris. And at the heart of the agenda, we will discuss the 4 Ps. To my mind, this is an absolute prerequisite. The agenda will be structured by a number of initiatives that I would like to recall here. We will continue to bring people together upon a request from the World Food Programme. The first such a summit will be held on October 18th and 19th. 2023. We will mobilize the entire planet around this very important agenda. We will also sponsor a reconstitution of the International Fund for Agricultural Development on December 14th and 15th in Paris. This is particularly important if we look at the current food crisis, and this will serve the farm initiative that we undertook when the war in Ukraine began, the goal being to strengthen the production capabilities of developing countries or intermediate income countries. So this trust-based partnership is based on the 4 Ps and the milestones that I just referenced, which are key to my mind. Over and beyond these milestones, of course, we will continue to develop our climate agenda. As always, climate and biodiversity go hand in hand. But here again, there are several milestones that will provide rhythm over the next few months. Of course, the COP28 talks at the end of the year. The climate crisis is getting worse. It's time we achieve results. And the climate crisis is the perfect illustration, and everything that I've been saying. We're seeing a number of emerging countries use the following political argument. The climate crisis is the responsibility of Western countries, so we shouldn't be doing the hard work. So there are a number of countries whose economy is mostly based on oil and gas. And we also need to look at the stigma attached to Western countries, European countries. To fight that, we need a trust-based partnership, particularly when it comes to protecting the climate. A meeting will be held by Kenya in a few weeks. President Ruto is committed to that effort, and I commend him for that. France will stand alongside him. We will roll out the Paris Agreement for people and the planet. We will set up the Nairobi summit and the COP28 talks. We will have new financing arrangements, newer, faster tools. We will mobilize the private sector as well. We also need to build new ambitions when it comes to energy. France will drive a very clear agenda with milestones for phasing out oil, gas, and coal. That's the reactor core of our battle. We need to reduce our oil dependency across the board and our coal dependency as well. AFD has great educational materials that clearly show the impact of coal. Let's stop over-investing politically in small projects in small countries where there's a lot of media hype when we need to focus on the most important thing. Emerging countries need to phase out coal, and that's the end of it. We are basing our just transition partnerships with Indonesia, Vietnam, Senegal on those things. And we will continue to roll out those agreements. And now let's focus on phasing out oil, gas, and coal. Let's continue partnerships with those main countries regarding green hydrogen, CCS, and the like. And the work on biodiversity and forest preservations, which are treasure troves of biodiversity as well as significant carbon sinks. Old-growth forests must be protected. That is a key aspect of our strategy. With the One Forest Summit in Libreville last March, we continued the work that started in Sharm el-Sheikh. Forests occupy 14% of global surface, mostly in the Amazon, in the Congo Basin, and Southeast Asia. So 14% of forest cover. The most precious tropical forests are home to 90% of known vertebrate ecosystems and 75% of recoverable carbon. So we created a lot of mechanisms for reforestation, but we're not promoting preservation of species. And every time deforestation takes place in those areas, it's a huge setback because we release massive amounts of carbon that cannot be recovered. We destroy ecosystems and biodiversity. And it's a huge setback. So we have built a new method. We will finalize it for the COP28 talks with biodiversity credits and a better operation of the carbon market. We have set up conservation partnerships that we started rolling out with Papua New Guinea and Gabon. Last summer, we're mobilizing both private sector and public sector financing to preserve those areas, working together with First Nations. And we're doing that in the Amazon as well, in our own jurisdiction, and also working with our various partners, including Brazil. Lastly, on the climate front, we're working on the oceans. That is a key challenge when it comes to the climate, of course, but also biodiversity and sovereignty. Over the past few months, huge advances have been made. The BBNJ, or Biodiversity Beyond National Jurisdictions agreements for the high seas. Many thanks to all of our teams for those efforts. Those agreements had been stalemated for a long time. We had difficult discussions. But now, landmark advances have been made, and this paves the way for the UN Conference on the Oceans to be held in Nice in June 2025. We are co-hosting this event with Costa Rica. So 2024, that'll be a milestone with Costa Rica. Nice in June 2025. And we need to get ready right here, right now, because ocean diplomacy is something we need to build, just like forest diplomacy. And these are very important drivers. First of all, because people can relate. Because these are new vehicles that help our credibility vis-à-vis the competition. And also, it's an opportunity for us to mobilize a diplomatic network in innovative ways. Lastly, I want us to get people on board when it comes to our trust-based cooperation partnerships on two different fronts. First of all, the fight against international inequalities. We need to achieve a fairer taxation system. We need the work that has been done in recent months need to be seen through when it comes to digital taxes that are still missed, that have to be overcome. And lastly, technology, particularly artificial intelligence. In recent years, we have worked at the heart of true diplomatic innovations, the Tech for Good Summit, for example. This is a new form of partnership, bringing together NGOs, governments, big business, all of the stakeholders behind technology. The starting point was the Christchurch call to action right here in May 2019. Many thanks to our New Zealand partners for that partnership. We will continue that partnership. This means that terrorist content can be taken down online in just 1 hour. And what we need to achieve is a digital order to protect children online. That is absolutely key. The second milestone of those efforts will take place in Paris during the Peace Forum. And it is the exact same method that we're using, a multi-stakeholder process that we're using for artificial intelligence. We have a common approach with Germany. Europe has started to regulate. So what is the challenge we need to address? We need to invest more in Europe so we can improve EU competitiveness compared with the competition. We need an investment agenda that will improve our competitiveness. But regulation should be factored in from the drawing board at the right level. Regulation of artificial intelligence can only take place effectively at the international level. We cannot regionalize such regulation efforts. It would be a mistake if Europe goes too far and too quickly, regulation-wise, right here, right now, even though we're not yet a driving force behind innovation efforts, we're taking a chance. Also because there's growing awareness of the need for regulation. This means that that's something that we need to engage with. We need to take the initiative. The British set up a first summit. That was important. During the Paris Peace Forum, we will also hold an important summit on regulation because the G7 has decided that regulatory agencies would be Paris-based. The World Partnership for Artificial Intelligence, which was created under the Canadian G7 presidency, has been consolidated by France when our turn came. And that is backed by OECD. The Global Partnership for Artificial Intelligence, UNESCO, which has ethical and cultural components, it's all based in Paris. So, of course, the onus is on us to devise new ways of thinking about artificial intelligence, but we need to work very closely with all of our partners as part of a multi-stakeholder process. Regulation must be factored in by design. As soon as the tools are designed in an approach that is as broad and as inclusive as possible, the OECD way. And also we need to look at aspects such as manipulation of information, fake news, etc., etc. This is an important agenda. As you can see, all of these partnerships are key to us, and I'm not giving you an exhaustive list of all the methods we will use. One last thing we will do during the Paris Peace Forum is our agenda for the Earth's poles. We will hold a diplomatic and scientific meeting to try and further consolidate our international strategy for the North Pole and the South Pole. Lastly, and that'll be my conclusion, this comes together with an agenda to maximize our influence and our outreach. This is part and parcel of what we've been doing, what you've been doing for years now, decades even. This is part and parcel of your commitment. But in my conclusion, let me say a few words about that. In these times, more now than ever, we need to strengthen our collective commitment to protecting the French language and culture. That is how we serve our country's geopolitical, strategic, political, and economic interests. The more people speak French, the more people understand who we are and our culture. I also believe that that agenda is useful to the regions where we implement it. We need to continue to develop the AEFE reform that we initiated so we can maximize quantitative and qualitatively schooling arrangements for children across the world. We are strengthening France's role as an educational power. Last July, I had an opportunity to bring together representatives of all Alliances Françaises. They are doing such great work. Many thanks also to the Institut Français, across the world, and also our museums and our cultural institutions. Congratulations to them for their diplomatic strategies, whether at home or abroad. We need to redouble our efforts, put forward more proposals with as much enthusiasm as we had initially.
And coming back.
You're watching France 24, and we've just been listening to the French President Emmanuel Macron making his annual address to French ambassadors there at the Élysée Presidential Palace in Paris.